Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Maximum Volume, The Life of Beatles producer George Martin, The Early Years, 1926 to 1966, by Kenneth Womack. Narrated by Paul Woodson. Music should humbly seek to please. Within these limits, great beauty may perhaps be found. Claude Debussy. Prologue. Good God, what have we got here? It was Wednesday, June 6th, 1962, and George Martin was flummoxed. For the most part, it had been a fairly quiet day in the life of the Parlophone A&R man, who at age 36 had become inured to working artists and repertoire. On most days he navigated a breakneck schedule of back-to-back meetings and recording sessions, one after another, and often from dawn until well after dusk. But today was relaxed by comparison, quiet even. George had taken a morning meeting with David Platts, a music publisher with whom he shared several ongoing business interests. They were natural collaborators, being two 30-somethings, having made their names on the London music scene as young execs on the rise. After lunch, George's afternoon had been devoted to his hilarious mates from beyond the fringe. Together, George and the comedy troupe had struck gold after the A&R man recorded their stage act on one of EMI's mobile units back in 1961. Under George's supervision, Parlophone enjoyed a hit record with the zany quartet of Alan Bennett, Peter Cook, Jonathan Miller, and Dudley Moore. And the future looked even more promising for George's clients, who were set to open Beyond the Fringe on Broadway in just a few short months. For George, good old British comedy had proven to be his salvation, saving his beleaguered record label in the bargain. But what he really wanted, truth be told, was to handle a beat group. He was absolutely driven by the notion of landing a rock combo, ferreting out hit songs for them, and generating one chart-topper after another. In his heart of hearts, what he longed for most was something along the lines of Cliff Richard and the Shadows, the beat music wunderkinds who recorded for Norrie Paramore, George's opposite number with EMI's Columbia imprint. George was incredibly jealous of Norrie, especially since the Columbia A&R man who had scored one chart sensation after another with Cliff Richard, who had emerged as Norrie's apparently unstoppable hit-making vehicle. That's what George wanted, all right, to develop a beat music juggernaut to rival Paramore's and enjoy the good life for a change. Who wouldn't? It was well known around the EMI corridors that Norrie tooled around the city in his brand-new E-Type Jaguar, when he wasn't driving his sports car out to his seaside place on the Sussex coast, that is. Oh, George definitely wanted a Jag. Of that he was certain. After a dinner break, George made his way to Abbey Road with Ron Richards, his assistant A&R man, strolling beside him. It was an early summer day in London as the two Parlophone colleagues contemplated the evening's recording session. How had they found themselves in such a position in the first place, having signed a contract with the very same Liverpool beat group that George had rebuffed back in February? George didn't hear anything earth-shattering in their sound, as he had told their manager, Brian Epstein, on that very first day when he played their acetate in his office. Walking toward the studio on that June evening, George and Ron still couldn't wrap their minds around the band's strange-sounding moniker. "Bloody silly name that is, Beatles," Richards said. "How corny can you get?" For the life of him, George couldn't figure out how they would even go about marketing them. Was it going to be John Lennon and the Beatles, or Paul McCartney and the Beatles? George wondered. When they arrived at Abbey Road, Richards made his way to the studio while George occupied himself in the canteen. Let Ron, his more than capable assistant, handle the session. Ron fancied himself as Parlophone's resident rock-and-roll man, after all. It's not like George was missing out on some groundbreaking moment in the presence of the next Elvis, as Brian Epstein had boasted back in February. Besides, EMI was incurring all of the session and production costs, which would never hit George's Parlophone budget. And what was the Beatles' contract worth anyway? It was a penny-per-record deal, no great investment on EMI's part. As Brian eagerly scanned the agreement in May, George knew something that the novice manager probably hadn't fully grasped. The Beatles' contract called for recording a mere 6 sides. Nothing more, nothing less. How long really would it take to knock off a half-dozen measly songs, anyway? A few wasted hours at most. And that's when tape operator Chris Neal found George in the canteen, telling him that he was wanted in the studio. Apparently, the Beatles had already caused quite a stir around Abbey Road. "Good God, what have we got here?" balance engineer Norman Smith had muttered to himself when the bandmates ambled into Studio 2. Their equipment was so ratty and tattered that Abbey Road's white-coated personnel had to rig up a series of workarounds just to get the session started. As Richards and Smith stared in wonder, verging on outright disgust, the Beatles had ripped off a cover version of Bésame Mucho before playing a composition of their own called, of all things, Love Me Do. When did beat bands begin writing their own tunes, especially beat bands from Liverpool? Moments later, George made the scene, joining his EMI colleagues in the control room above the studio floor. There they were, standing before him for the very first time. 21-year-old John Lennon on rhythm guitar, 19-year-old Paul McCartney on bass, 19-year-old George Harrison on lead guitar, and 20-year-old Pete Best on drums. As George looked on, the band played 2 more original compositions called P.S. I Love You and Ask Me Why. With 4 songs under their belts, the band members joined George and his team up in the control room. Without saying a word, the lanky ex-Navy man commanded their full attention. Towering over them in his neat, well-pressed suit, George looked for all intents and purposes like pure upper-crust London to these rural, north country scousers from Liverpool. And when he opened his mouth, George spoke with a posh accent to boot. He couldn't have been any more intimidating if he tried. As the boys fired up their cigarettes, George took the floor, and for the next 20 minutes he lectured his much younger charges, mercilessly critiquing nearly every aspect of their performance, from the slipshod nature of their vocal delivery to their sloppy musicianship. He even took issue with the way John Lennon played his harmonica during Love Me Do. Eventually, the veteran A&R man brought his lengthy, scathingly candid diatribe to an end, and he actually began to feel sorry for the Beatles, having railed against them for so long. "Look, I've laid into you for quite a time, and you haven't responded," said George, as the group members waited quietly before him in the control room. "Is there anything that you don't like?" For a moment the 4 Beatles glanced back and forth at one another, nervously shuffling their feet. After giving Martin a hard, lingering stare, guitarist George Harrison retorted, in perfect deadpan, "Well, for a start, I don't like your tie." After an awkward moment, everyone in the room, which had lapsed into an unearthly silence, erupted with laughter. As the tension briskly evaporated, everyone was in on the hilarity, with George joining the Beatles in a moment of uproarious merriment. Later, after the band had left the studio for the evening, George remained in the control room with his Parlophone brain trust, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Norman spoke up first, saying, "Phew, what do you think of that lot, then?" In his mind, George had already decided that they were rotten composers, and that their own stuff wasn't any good. Yet, sitting there with Richards and Smith, Martin admitted to his colleagues, "There is something special about them. I can't tell you what, but there is something there." And while he didn't quite know what that something was just yet, he knew that something very unusual had transpired on that early summer evening in Studio 2. During that one instant, Harrison had very possibly saved the Beatles from the EMI dustbin. Martin was quite sure that he didn't like the group's musicianship or their original material, but after years of toil at Parlophone Records, he knew comedy, and these guys, if nothing else, were funny. Even in the darkest of moments, when the chips were down, they knew how to laugh at themselves, as Harrison had so clearly revealed. And Martin could work with that. They may be funny, these Liverpool scousers, but were they worth the risk? That was the signal question that he pondered as he made his way back to his apartment that night. To his ears, They still weren't very good musicians.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?